In Whitford County in the summer, the air was thick with dust and heat. It was the kind of air that stuck to a man's face and made the cotton rows shine like a mirage. People in towns along the Arkansas River talked about the battle at Vicksburg and how it was getting closer and closer to Little Rock. It was said that you could drop a seed on this area of land and see it grow by nightfall, 30 miles west of the city. This is where a much quieter war was being fought, one where there were no drums, flags, or shots fired in public. 81 people went missing from the rolling fields and oak forests around Whitford Estate in just 20 months. They were not slaves who got away or soldiers who got lost in the chaos of war. The estate promised steady work and a safe place to live in a land that was short on both. The people who came were free men and women, farmhands, artists, widows, and even whole families. They never came back. At the time, official accounts said that the people who went missing were either transferred during the war, had accidents on the river, or the odd run-in with roving Confederate troops. But the real story, which has been kept secret for more than 100 years in military records, was much more planned and much grosser. It starts with the Whitford family, whose cotton crops in 1863 were so good that they beat all the problems that their neighbors were having. Other plantations were dying because they couldn't find enough workers, and the Union had blockades in place, but Whitford bales still sent wagon loads of goods to both Confederate depots and Union quartermaster posts. Elias stood in the middle of it all. Whitford, a man whose charm could make an enemy weak in one breath and ruin him in the next. Elias was 45 years old that summer. He had the long body and slow, deliberate movements of someone who was used to being watched and followed. His voice had a faint light that came from growing up in Virginia and the prep schools he went to before his family moved west. His pale, cold blue eyes seemed even sharper when he judged the worth of the person standing in front of him. His hair was already gray at the temples. Next to him Celeste Whitford, his wife of 22 years, ran the estate like a military base. She was born into a tobacco family in Virginia and learned how to run an estate from the time she was a child. It wasn't just flour, molasses, and lamp oil that Celeste meticulously kept track of. She also wrote down every light that burned in every room and every pound of cotton that left the gin. The set of her jaw could quickly stop a kitchen full of chatter. She rarely raised her voice. Their twin boys, Lucian and Marcus, were very smart like their parents, but not as smart as. They kept their cool. Lucien was a few minutes older than him, short, had big eyes, and was always covered in ink or chemical stains from his projects. Marcus had broad shoulders, a short fuse, and felt much more at ease with a gun or a chain than with a notebook. By the summer of 1863, the Whitfords had perfected a plan that, at first glance, looked like it would save the desperate. One Rivertown boarding house told another about this plan, which was what would bring the first of those 81 people, victims to their gates, holding on to what little they still owned and smiling with hope. That promise was just a front. Like the bleached columns at Whitford Estates, under it was the machinery of a killing spree that was so well planned and quick that even seasoned military agents had a hard time believing it had been hidden for so long. From the road along the river, Whitford Estate looked like a monument to lasting beauty. The main house was built in, 1832 by Elias's father, had 3 full stories. Its 6 curved Corinthian columns make it look like the whole building is made of ivory. 2 levels of curved balconies looked out over 2,300 acres of black loam, stitched with rows of cotton that were so straight they looked like they were measured by a surveyor's rod. Some homes' wells dried up during the war, but a marble fountain on the south yard still dumped water into a basin in the sun. There was a faint smell of beeswax and camphor in the air inside, chandeliers from Paris that were brought in, broken light onto mahogany wood that had been sitting for almost 10 years before it was put in place. Family pictures were carved into mantels made of Italian marble. Elias wearing a dark suit coat. Celeste dressed in the stiff silks of Richmond's upper class. Lucian and Marcus were caught when they were young teens. One was holding a book and the other a gun for shooting. People outside these walls thought the flow of life inside them was a sign of genteel order. Celeste's looping, careful financial books were really what kept the house running like a well-oiled machine. Fortress. Each pound of soap, each ounce of flour, and each light stub was tracked down. Staff knew that even the loss of a single serving spoon would get them called to the mistress's room, where they would be met with a cold, unblinking stare until they told the truth. Elias, on the other hand, had built up an image of being separate from the daily work. His neighbors said he was concerned about the big picture. In 1863, that meant he could play both sides of the war with an ease that was equal parts brave and cool, doing the math. Confederate wagons brought cotton from Whitford fields to stores in Little Rock. Those same bales then ended up on Union barges going north. Elias got paid twice, and no one seemed too eager to press further into the deal. Lucien kept the books for the farm, but he was very good at a lot more than just books. He had studied chemistry before the war stopped him from going to school, and he kept a locked room in the back of the property's converted carriage house. Packed with glass vials, powders, and papers with a tight code written on them. Marcus, on the other hand, was in charge of the field teams. Marcus had fear as his tool, while Lucian had a pen. His voice was like a whip crack in the middle of the day, and more than one worker learned that disobeying him had consequences that workers on nearby farms had never seen. It was talked about in whispers along the river that the Whitford was doing very well by the summer of that year. What was it like? Friends asked. That they never seemed to be short of people to help them in their fields, even when other farms were half-assed on workers. Plus, who were these workers who showed up at dawn with their faces hidden under big hats and left at night in areas that no one was allowed to enter? The answer was in the way the Whitford hired people, which was planned in Elias's study and carried out with the precision of a military operation. It looked like a good plan on paper, but in fact, it locked desperate people in, ways that would make it impossible for them to get away. There was an ad at the start. From Memphis to St. Louis, from New Orleans to smaller towns along the river, there were neat lines hidden in the back pages of newspapers. To work on the Whitford estate, they need field hands, skilled tradespeople, and housekeepers, good pay, a place to stay, and steady work all season long. Do it in person. For someone who had lost everything, a husband or son in the war, a farm that had burned down, or a shop that had closed, it read like freedom. And when they got there, they were tired from traveling, so when they got to the estate gates, Marcus barked or Lucian stared coldly at them. But Elias himself met them, being polite and assuring them that they were in the right place. For Arkansas during the war, $2.25 a day, plus food and housing, seemed like a lot of money. It was more than a lot of industry workers in Little Rock could hope to make. But there was one condition, which Elias said was just a formality, and was written in the clear, careful hand of someone who had already written a contract. Each worker would have to stay on the farm for at least 2 years, and their pay would be held in trust until the end of their term. The answer was clear and strong. Elias would hand the pen across the desk and say, "We find it keeps things stable. Shields you from the effects of the war, keeps the work here steady, and stops pay from rising." Most of them signed right away. Some people asked questions, but a man who had to feed his kids or a woman who had slept outside the night before didn't have much wiggle room. Later, after the ink had dried and they had moved into the workers' rooms, which were tucked away among the pecan trees, did the arrangement show what it really was. If you left the estate before the 2 years were up, you broke the contract and lost all of your wages. The Whitfords liked to remember their workers that breaking the contract could also mean losing other rights, but they left that part of the sentence very vague. Within a few weeks of the first ads, Whitford Estates fields were full of new people. An Irish worker who hummed while she did her job, a retired worker whose hands are scarred from years of work, 4 young adults with 2 sons who are all eager to work. They came with hope, thanks, and a mark on their hearts that they didn't know about. The other side of the notebook, which no one outside the estate had seen yet, started to fill up line by line with names that would never be spoken out loud in Whitford County again. Evans County blacksmith Owen Callahan was the first person to go missing. He had lost his forge to a request from the Confederacy. The last week of October 1862, he moved to Whitford Estate. He told his sister in Pine Bluff that he would send word as soon as he was settled. A letter from Lucian Whitford, not Owen, arrived 6 weeks later. It said that Owen had been fired without pay for being drunk and stealing. Mary Callahan, his sister, said her brother hadn't had a drink since the year their father drank himself to death. She called Sheriff Amos Dillard and told him about her problem, but Lucian's. The information was perfect. As proof, there were dated entries, witness accounts, and even a whiskey bottle that had been seized. 2 months later, Clara Wren, a young tailor who had just moved to Little Rock from Cork, Ireland, left her boarding house with a carpet bag and the promise of a job in the Whitford family. Her landlord was waiting for her to come back with the rest of her things within a week. She never came back. In February, a whole family went missing. Matthew Harrell was hired along with his skilled worker for cotton gins, wife Ruth and their 2 teenage sons. They sold their small farm near Benton, put their things in a wagon and drove all day to get to the estate. A neighbor saw them go south on Whitford Road. They were never seen again. Simon Burke, a carpenter from Shelby County, was the last person to speak out before the whispers really started. He wrote 1 letter to his wife, making sure she knew he was safe and sound, and that he would come home when his job was over. When months went by without. To put it another way, she went alone. Elias met her at the door and told her that he was sorry to tell her that Simon had quit his job without warning one night and left all of his tools behind. By the spring of 1863, 4 disappearances could still be explained by bad luck or the chaos of war. But in Whitford County, where word got around faster than wagons, a trend was beginning to form. When people like Mary Callahan asked questions, they were given ledgers, witnesses, and the cold confidence that it wouldn't be proven on paper what had happened. People were being eaten alive by something behind the white columns and well-kept lawns. By the beginning of April, Sheriff Amos Dillard had heard enough pieces of the same story to know it wasn't a mistake. A man in his late 40s with a worn-out face and the deliberate steps of someone who knows how to listen before moving. They had known each other since they were young guys, says Dillard. He had seen Elias talk an I-8 and bargain cotton prices down to nothing, rival into shaking hands at the same table. But these disappearances, which were all connected to the farm, were like grit in his teeth. When Dillard first went to the Whitford estate, he said he was there to receive a normal tax payment. Elias met him on the wide front steps. He was wearing a black frock coat and had a leather-bound notebook in his hand. Before the sheriff could say anything, Elias opened it and saw neatly written notes about each worker's exit. DUI, theft, and leaving someone behind. 3 statements from witnesses. Listen to each story. The paper was thick and cost a lot. The ink was still bright on the cream-colored pages. You could trust the witnesses on paper. Marcus Whitford was the foreman, Luther Craven was the estate's head overseer, and a third person, usually one of the younger workers, was chosen at random. Dillard knew what to do. Change the names so that the records looked normal. Even so, it was too good. As they stood there, a strong, unpleasant smell came from outside the house. Not the smell of manure that you know, or It tastes like cotton bolls that have been left out in the sun for too long and have turned sweet. It made him think of the tannery outside of town, but it was heavy, like it was being pulled by steam. Elias didn't seem to notice. Elias closed the book with a soft thud and said, "I'm sure you get it, Sheriff." He let the thought hang in the air as he said, "Order is the only thing that keeps a place like this from falling apart. I give every man and woman here a fair chance, but when that trust is broken..." Dillard sped up. He rode back to town with the papers in his horse bag. He could still smell the chemical smell in the air. The signatures were steady, the dates were correct, and all the accounts were filled out. He had been in the service for 20 years, so he knew deep down that something was very wrong. 3 days later, he learned that Mary Callahan had been found dead in the Saline River and that her reticule and the picture of her brother were missing. This made him feel even worse. The government study said it looked like an accident. This book seemed like a watch out. Some workers had broken the rules, and Luther Craven's name had been in Elias Whitford's ledgers more than once. He had no trouble with the part for many years. That was his job since Elias's father had been in charge of the estate. It was part of the job to enforce the rules, no matter how strict they were. But by the spring of 1963, something about the numbers was bothering him. The Whitford farm had 71 workers on paper, not counting the family and housekeepers. But when Luther walked, when the Rose came up himself at dawn, he could never count more than 43 heads against the rising sun. At first he said it was because he was sick or had other tasks to do on the land, but the gap kept happening week after week. The grocery shops also had their own quiet story to tell. The flour barrels didn't last as long as they should have. It should have been down to the bone, but the salt pork hung there in the smokehouse still whole. The nights came next. Around 2 a.m., lights were waved low across the yard. Moving with Lucien and Marcus, going toward the rooms with 2 men Luther didn't know. They were pale and thin, and their hands were soft like traders, not rough from working in the fields. Each person carried a worn-out leather bag that made a soft clink sound when they put it down. While in the cabin, the brothers would stay for 20 minutes and then come out with the strangers. Sometimes they would be carrying a big canvas bundle between them, and other times they would have nothing. There would be a blank spot in the bunkhouse by dawn. The bed was made up nicely, and the person's things were gone, as if they had never been there. No one spoke, out in the open. People kept their eyes down in the fields. When Marcus walked by, the conversation stopped. Luther had told himself for months that it didn't matter to him. Men came and went from farms all the time, and it was easier to explain disappearances during wartime. But there was now too big of a difference between what he saw and what the book said. It was a hot April night, and the moon was just a thin smear over the pecan trees. Luther chose to follow, and what he saw before dawn made it clear what it was. What's going on under the Whitfords' home. That night, the air was thick enough to drink. It smelled like wet ground from a storm in the late afternoon. Luther stayed in the shadows between the rooms. He moved when the lantern light went out and stopped when Marcus's boots hit something close by. Lucien led the way to a low cabin on the edge of the workers' property. This was the cabin that Jonah Fields, a quiet, broad-shouldered man from Pine Bluff, had been assigned to. He had been asking questions about the missing. Luther crouched behind a rain barrel and watched as the pale strangers joined the brothers inside. 20 minutes went by. The 4 guys came out in a single line when the door opened again. There was a long bundle of canvas stretched out between Lucien and Marcus. Dark spots were running through the fabric. A grunt let Marcus move the weight. Lucienne kept looking over his shoulder as if the knight were there to see her. They went across the pasture, skipping the Whitford family graveyard, which was a square fenced-in area with smooth marble gravestones, and went deeper into the woods. Besides, Luther followed behind him, and he could hear his own breath too well. After going 100 yards, an orange flash showed up in front of them. A flashlight buried in the ground next to a big hole. Elias Whitford was already there. He had taken off his coat and rolled up his sleeves to his elbows. As the bundle was dropped into the ground, he spoke in a low, steady voice. Luther didn't understand every word, but one line stood out. 81 souls to build something that will last longer than all of us. One of the pale guys took the cork off of a bottle and turned it over, letting a stream of clear liquid fall into the grave. From 20 feet away, Luther could feel the sharp chemical bite of quicklime in his nose when the powder hit what was inside the cloth. Steam hissed. They worked so carefully that it chilled him, filling in the hole, spreading leaves around, and moving clumps of moss around so the ground looked like it had never been touched. Then, without any ceremony, they went toward a worn-out barn on the edge of the woods. Luther wanted to run away out of fear, but he had a deeper need to see, too. No. They pulled him after them. The barn stood out in the dark, and the moonlight made the worn boards shine like silver. Luther walked slowly along its side until he reached a space between the planks. The smell was the first thing that hit me. It was a sharp chemical on top of the sweet, heavy smell of death. He saw something that no man should ever see through the small hole. 5 big wooden vats lined up along the far wall were full to the brim, with a milky liquid that sparkled in the torchlight. The pale men, who Luther would later learn were called the Poe brothers, moved between them. With the skill of skilled workers, stirring with paddles that have long handles. Every so often they lifted the grates that sat inside, shaking free anything that was stopping the quick limes from eating. Nearby, on trestle tables, things were neatly arranged. A carpenter's plane, sewing shears, a silver locket, and rings in a small wooden box. Luther's stomach stiffened when he saw Jonah Field's belt buckle next to Owen Callahan's old, worn-out leather tool roll. In the corner, A crucible inside the small red burner spat out molten gold. It was next to 2 ingot molds that already had cooling bars in them. These bars were blank, so they were ready to sell without any questions. And on a desk close to the door, lit only by one yellow light, was the proof that proved everything they thought they knew. A notebook with exact lines running through the pages that was filled in by Lucian Whitford's careful hand. Each note had a name, the date the person arrived, the date they left, and a list of their belongings, and how much they were worth. Talked to Owen Callahan on November 2nd, 1862. Belt buckle 38 is a tool. Wren, Clara, January 12th, 1863. $24 for a sewing kit and a silver charm. Harold's family, February 3rd, 1863. $142 for a wagon, tools, and living items. There are 81 lines, and each one is a life cut down to an account amount. It said at the bottom of the last page that their deaths had made $5,327. Luther took a short breath. This was not taking advantage of the war. This was a business. The Whitfords had set up a system for killing and making money that was as organized and separate as any business in Little Rock. And the night with him wasn't over yet. Luther was moving away from the wall when he stepped on a loose board. It broke when he stepped on it, making a sharp crack that shook the night like a gunshot. There were no more voices inside. There was only the hiss of the furnace and the faint creak of a vat's paddle for a moment. After that came Lucienne's voice, which was harsh and tight. "There's someone out there." Marcus's answer was like a growl. "I'll bring the dogs." Luther did not wait. He turned around and ran along the edge of the fence, his breath cutting through the air. The Whitford's dog's deep, angry bark came from behind him. The lantern light flashed and moved through the trees. The brothers yelled directions, and the lighter men joined in with faster, higher voices that pushed them on. The evening storm made the ground slippery. As Luther jumped into the pecan grove to get to the low creek bed he'd used 100 times to circle the land, branches hit him in the face. Line, but his fear made him move slowly. He fell into the gully when his foot got caught on a secret path. He felt a crack in his teeth as pain tore up his leg. Just above the ankle, the bone gave way. He fell into the shallow water and squished himself into the mud. He tried not to cry. The dogs were getting closer, and you could hear their barking through the trees above. The room was filled with Marcus's voice. Our plan is to make it look like he fell off his horse, just like the people. Then Lucian's tone turned colder and more measured. Then burn the page from the notebook. The circle was being closed as they moved toward him. Luther's only thoughts were the beating in his heart, and the fact that he would be the 82nd line in Lucian's book if the night didn't finish him while he was lying in a ditch. The miracle came when the horse rode by. The steady clop of hooves cut through the barking dogs from outside the grove. A voice that was low and sharp, with the short rhythm of... The sound of "Who's there?" was made by the Union Army. Lantern light swung toward the sound, and the Whitford's chase stopped for a moment. Luther could make out the shape of a dark-coated horseman in a tall bay tree through the bunch of branches. With the gun in one hand and the other stretched toward Luther, the man swung down with practiced ease. "My name is Sergeant Calvin Mercer," he said, as he knelt down and looked up at the trees. "You look like hell. Can you ride?" Luther grabbed his arm and spat them out. "Through teeth that are closed. People are being killed. 81 buried out there. Set up everything. Everything from lime pits to ledgers." Mercer's jaw got tight, but he didn't ask any questions. He picked Luther up, put him across the seat, and then swung around behind him. When the geeling moved forward, their feet stirred up mud as screams came from behind them. A gunshot broke a peon branch into pieces just above Luther's head. As they ran out of the grove and onto the road by the river, the dogs' calls got quieter behind them. It was only then that Mercer... He looked back to make sure they weren't being watched. "I've been keeping an eye on that spot for 3 days," he said over Luther's rough breathing. Luther told him in gasps, "I wasn't sure what I saw, but I knew it smelled like more than cotton. The fake contracts, the workers who went missing at the grave at midnight, and the barn with its vats and furnace." Mercer had already decided what he was going to do when he saw the lights of Little Rock flashing ahead. He would take Luther right to the main office of the Union, and if the man's story came true, Whitford Estate was about to be hit by a different kind of army. By morning, Calvin Mercer had Luther Craravin lying on a cot in the Union field offices. His broken leg was raised, and he was speaking so quickly that it seemed like he was afraid someone would take his words away. He had drawn a rough plan with shaky hands, showing where the barn was, where the workers lived, and where the graves were hidden in the woods. The officers huddled over it. Major Alistair Rhodes, a big man with a... He listened with a stone-cold face. Rhodes tapped the map twice with his fingertip when Luther was done. "If even half of what you say is true, Mr. Craravin, that's a level of murder I've never seen anywhere else. Today, we move." In the middle of the morning, on June 21st, 1863, a full company of Union infantry was riding hard toward Whitford Estate. They were flanking the property from the west pasture and the river road. Luther had his map in his pocket and was walking along Mercer Road Point. The white columns of the estate were coming into view. Even though it was hot, the air didn't feel right. There was no noise from the gin or the yard. A jar stood next to the front door, and the fountain on the lawn dumped water into a basin full of magnolia leaves. Roads spread out the squads. The barn looked exactly like Luther had said it would. There were vats lined up against the wall, a furnace that was still slightly warm, and tables full of personal items that couldn't have been mistaken for abandoned goods. There were also 3 ledgers. The last page was from just 2 nights ago. In the study by Elias Whitford, it was more scary what they found. He had a stack of papers in his hand that laid out plans to expand the operation after the war to include freed slaves, whites who had to leave their homes, and new immigrants who were ready to be taken away quickly. There was no sign of the Whitford family, though. Locks were taken off of desks and drawers were taken out of trunks. Horse tracks, clean and deep, went east toward the river. In order to start the dig at dawn, Rhodes told them to seal off the ground. If the graves were there, he said they would find them, and Whitford County would know what had been growing all this time. Just after sunrise, the first shovels went into the ground. They were clearly marked on Luther's map. In the woods, there are small openings with only a few leaves and, in some places, a faint depression in the ground. At the base of each site, a thin wooden stake stuck out, but there was no writing on it. A hot iron was used to burn in only a few. The work took a long time. The summer. Once the top layers of dirt gave way, a sharp, stinging smell of quicklime rose up. The ground was very hard and packed down. There wasn't much left to find in most graves. A piece of bone, an old piece of cloth that is stiff, and a button that is half-eaten by corrosion. Even so, the stakes are exactly the same as the ledgers. There are 81 of them, and each number matches a name and date in Lucian's careful columns. Some finds put an end to all the work. A child's shoe that was way too small was found with a bent silver spoon. A wedding ring, its writing can still be read, M.H. to R.H. 1857. Mercer carried a brass carpenter square to Luther's cot. The overseer narrowed his eyes as he quickly named the person who owned it. The dig went on for almost 4 weeks, spreading out from the estate's edges as more unmarked sites were found. When engineers from the Little Rock Rail Depot were called in, they made makeshift screens to sort the soil for metal or bone. Every piece they found, no matter how small, was marked, logged, and stored. To get around. The count looked bad by the time the last pit was full. 81 victims were confirmed, and more were thought to be alive in places where quicklime had blocked out all but chemical evidence. Sometimes, families came from miles away to see what had been found. For them, closure was a bitter gift. They left with a ring, a pocket knife, and a piece of embroidered fabric. They knew that their family members were killed and buried in a place they trusted. The question still hung over the camp. Where did the Whitford family go? The look for the Whitfords began before all the graves were filled. From Little Rock to St. Louis, posters said that Elias, Celeste, Lucian, and Marcus would be paid a lot of money if they were found alive or dead. But in the summer of 1963, Arkansas was full of lies and people who dropped out of sight quickly. Some people said they saw the family riding fast along the river road to Helena. Their horses were tied down and their eyes were fixed ahead. Others talked about seeing a flatboat at midnight going south toward the open water of the Mississippi. 1. According to the story, they got on a schooner in New Orleans with fake names and set sail for Havana. There was no way to confirm the report. What did come to the surface was much worse and closer. On the 3rd day, after the first rumors, the bodies of the 2 pale strangers, the Poe brothers, were found in the Arkansas River. Their throats had been cut open. The person who shut them up didn't take anything. They still had their boots, belts, and even their signet rings on. The crime wasn't theft, it was a blade. A lot of roads read the coroner's. Write the note in silence, fold it right away, and set it down. Loose ends, he told Mercer. Before they talk, you tie them up. That means that if the Whitfords were still alive, they had left their partners to drown in the mud. A last act that told more about their code than any book could. And somewhere outside the Union lines they carried the information, and maybe the money from the deaths of 81 people in the woods. It caught more people. It reached river towns and refugee camps where strangers came from, and didn't give names. But the Whitfords were gone, just like their victims before them. They were nowhere to be found. As there were no living family members to claim the estate, it was given to the federal government. The great house was used as a Union hospital for the rest of the war. The parlors were lined with CS, and the grand dining room was turned into a surgical ward. Soldiers who were locked up there talked in low tones about the smell that seemed to stick to the walls. It was a sour-sweet smell that couldn't be hidden. Scrubbing could get rid of. The building was empty when the fighting was over. People in the area avoided the house because they said lantern lights flickered in the windows at night and voices murmured from the pecan bush. Some people tried to rent the fields, but the work never went through. Plow blades hit pale coastal land where nothing would grow, and people left rather than spend the day in the shade of the columns. The house was just a shell by 1884. The land was bought by the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. The house was torn down, and they built a switchyard on top of the front lawn. The fountain stones were taken away with cards. The Peason Grove was cut down. But the trees still grew badly in the back acres where the stakes used to be to mark the ground. Luther Kreroven lived through it all. After giving evidence to the military court, he didn't get a steady job. Instead, he did odd jobs and spent long periods of time alone in a cabin not 2 miles from where the estate had been. This caused him to limp, which slowed him down but never stopped him from going along the old fence lines. His neighbors said he was a man who looked good but didn't say much. He felt like a weight was on him, like a part of him had stayed in the grove that April night. After that, he wrote down what he had seen, not for the courts but for the day when he would no longer be able to speak. According to the county judge, Luther left behind a sealed envelope written to the Arkansas State Historical Society. This was found when he died in 1889. It was marked to not be opened until he was dead. A statement and a number were written inside. The number could bring the dead back to life, if not physically. Luther's last will and testament was written in a careful, almost schoolmasterly hand. Each line told the truth that he had never said out loud. He wrote that the 81 graves that were found in 1863 were not the whole thing. Based on what he saw over the course of months of watching, peaceful times when no one was working, and nights when more than one bundle was taken into the woods. The real number was more like 110. Some of those people who died would never be named. These men were drifters off the river. They were freed slaves who had left no family behind. They were young men going west with tools in their satchels and nothing that tied them to a town. They just disappeared, with no one asking about them or looking for them. The Whitfords had picked them because of that very reason. Even scarier, Luther wrote that he had heard Elias talk about other places where the same things could happen, like farms in Mississippi and Louisiana, whether those were not in use. If they were statements or signs of a bigger network, Luther couldn't say. But he insisted that the whole story be told so that it wouldn't grow again in some other area. Many years after the war, historians have argued about whether the Whitford killings were a horrible one-time event or just one case that was brought to light. What is certain is how carefully the family ran their business, the allure of high pay and contracts, and the quick removal of anyone who dared to question their fate. Every move was planned, every Killing turned into a line in a book. The profit and loss were added up. The builder was a man named Elias Whitford, who saw people as raw materials. Celeste was the housekeeper and made sure the house was as clean as the killing grounds. Lucian kept the books, and his math was as cold as a banker's. Marcus used both his hands and his words to make them do what they wanted, and the Poe brothers' medical knowledge erased all traces of violence, making death a clean deal. That the family got away with it. There is a truth in Whitford County that keeps getting lost in the fog of rumors and sightings that haven't been proven. They may have died in the river, or they may have lived out their days under fake names and kept their money. There's never been any proof. When you drive along Riverbend Road, most people don't even bother to look at the small state sign. Instead, they just pass it by. The only words that read are in memory of the victims of Whitford Estate. God knows what their names are. But in the records, Luther Craven's letter is still there. We can learn the most important lesson from the man who limped along those fence lines until the day he died. That when there is chaos, there are always people who will make money off of the dead, and that the most dangerous predators are not the ones who roar, but the ones who smile, offer work, and wait for you. This story might have given you chills. If you want to read more stories about lost histories, please subscribe. Don't miss a show. Please give the station a like and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. We always love hearing from people who are interested in dark history.